August 17, 1944. The air near Chambois, France, carried a stench so thick it seemed to have physical weight. General George S. Patton stood at the edge of what would become known as the Falaise Pocket, surveying a landscape transformed into something from a medieval vision of hell. As far as he could see, the roads were choked with destroyed German equipment, burned-out tanks, overturned trucks, dead horses still in their traces, and bodies. Thousands of them. Patton pulled out his diary that evening and wrote words that would capture what he'd witnessed. Quote, "Zero. This was the moment. The moment when Patton first truly saw the German army, not just retreating, but disintegrating. And what he said, what he did, and how he reacted to this collapse would define the final year of the war in Europe. The destruction at Falaise represented the culmination of Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy that Patton's Third Army had exploited with a speed that shocked even Allied high command. The German Seventh Army, caught in a pocket between American, British, and Canadian forces, had been systematically destroyed. Estimates suggested between 10 and 15,000 Germans died in the pocket, with another 40 to 50,000 captured. But the numbers barely captured the reality of what Patton was seeing. He walked among the wreckage with his characteristic swagger stick, his polished helmet catching the August sun. His aide noticed the general's jaw working, a sign those who knew him recognized a suppressed emotion. Not horror, exactly. Patton had seen death before, had studied ancient battlefields, had read extensively about Cannae and other great encirclements. But this was different. This was industrial-scale destruction. This was what happened when modern firepower met a trapped army. To the reporters who managed to catch him that day, Patton's message was direct and aggressive. The Germans are running, and we're going to keep them running. No sympathy in his voice. No reflection on the human cost, just the predatory instinct of a commander who sensed his enemy was broken and wanted to finish the job. Because that's what Patton saw at Falaise. Not just a tactical victory, not just a successful encirclement. He saw the beginning of the end. The German army in France was no longer an organized fighting force capable of sustained operations. It was a mob, streaming eastward, abandoning equipment, surrendering in groups of hundreds and thousands, and Patton wanted to chase them all the way to Berlin. His Third Army had become operational on August 1st, and in the 16 days since, it had rampaged across Brittany and then wheeled east in the great encirclement that trapped the Germans at Falaise. Now, with the pocket closed, Patton's instinct was to pursue, to give the Germans no time to reform, no time to establish new defensive lines, no time to catch their breath. On August 19th, he sent a message to General Omar Bradley, his immediate superior and former subordinate. The frustration in Patton's words was palpable, but finishing the job required fuel. And fuel was something Third Army was running desperately short of. The logistics of the Allied advance had become a nightmare. The invasion had been planned around the assumption that major French ports would be captured and operational. Instead, the Germans held the port cities, and everything the Allies needed had to come across the Normandy beaches, then be trucked hundreds of miles to armies that were advancing faster than anyone had anticipated. Patton's Third Army was at the end of a very long supply line, and it was a supply line that couldn't keep up. By late August, as Third Army approached the Meuse River, Patton's tanks were literally running dry. Units were halting not because of German resistance, but because they had no fuel to continue. For an aggressive commander like Patton, this was agony. He could see the German army in full retreat. He had prisoners telling him that there was nothing behind them, no prepared defenses, no reserves. The road to Germany was open, and he was stuck. His famous quote from this period captured his fury. "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks have got to have gas." The decision had been made at the highest levels to prioritize Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group for supplies. Montgomery's plan, eventually executed as Operation Market Garden, called for a thrust through the Netherlands to cross the Rhine and potentially end the war by Christmas. Patton's Third Army, despite its spectacular advances, would have to wait. Patton raged. In his diary, in conversations with Bradley, in barely concealed comments to reporters, he made his frustration clear. He believed the Germans were finished, that one more hard push would collapse whatever remained of their Western forces. He saw the fuel allocation decision as timid, as a failure to exploit success, as exactly the kind of cautious thinking that let beaten enemies escape. His diary entries from late August and early September are filled with observations about German weakness. He wrote, "The prisoners coming in told the same story. Units that had been shattered at Falaise, replacements who were undertrained, equipment that was abandoned for lack of fuel, officers who had lost contact with higher command." But Patton also noticed something else in those prisoners, something that would prove significant in the months ahead. The fanatical Nazis were mostly gone, dead or fled. What remained were ordinary German soldiers, many of them relieved to be out of the war. They talked. They told their captors about conditions in Germany, about Allied bombing, about shortages, about the growing sense that the war was lost. A defeated enemy, Patton noted, was a pitiful sight. By mid-September, the fuel situation had eased enough for Third Army to resume offensive operations. But the opportunity Patton had seen in August was gone. The Germans had used the breathing space to establish new defensive lines. The Siegfried Line, Germany's western fortifications, now had troops manning it. The easy pursuit was over. The autumn of 1944 became a grinding campaign through Lorraine, fighting for fortified cities like Metz. The weather turned miserable. Rain and mud slowed operations. The German army, while clearly losing, was still capable of fierce defensive fighting, especially on its own soil. Then came December 16th and the German offensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's last major gamble in the West, throwing his carefully hoarded reserves against the weakest part of the American line. The attack achieved complete surprise. German forces smashed through American positions, creating a dangerous bulge in the Allied lines and trapping the 101st Airborne Division in the town of Bastogne. For Eisenhower and the Allied High Command, it was a crisis. For Patton, it was an opportunity. At a meeting in Verdun on December 19th, Eisenhower asked his commanders how quickly they could counterattack. Patton stunned the room by saying he could attack in 2 days with 3 divisions. It seemed impossible. Third Army was engaged in offensive operations to the south. To disengage, turn 90 degrees north, and attack into the flank of the German offensive would require moving hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of vehicles through winter weather on crowded roads. Most commanders would have needed a week or more. Patton had already planned for it. He'd sensed something was coming and had his staff work out contingency plans. Now he executed those plans with characteristic speed. On December 22nd, Third Army attacked north. By December 26th, Patton's 4th Armored Division had broken through to Bastogne, relieving the surrounded paratroopers. It was one of Patton's finest moments. The rapid movement, the aggressive counterattack, the relief of Bastogne all demonstrated Third Army at its best. But it also demonstrated something about the German army. They could still attack, they could still fight hard, but they couldn't sustain operations. Their offensive ran out of fuel, just as Patton's had in August. Their reserves were committed and destroyed, and when Third Army hit their flank, the Germans had nothing left to stop it. By late January 1945, the bulge had been eliminated. The Germans were back where they started, minus the troops and equipment they'd lost, and now the Allies were ready for the final push into Germany itself. Patton's observations about the German army were evolving. In his diary and letters, he noted the quality of German soldiers was declining. "The Germans are scraping the bottom of the barrel," he wrote. "We're fighting old men and children." It was true. The Wehrmacht was throwing Volkssturm units, essentially militia made up of men too old or too young for regular service, into defensive positions. Boys of 15 and 16, men in their 50s and 60s, given rifles and told to stop the American advance. Patton found it both pathetic and infuriating. Pathetic because these were not soldiers in any real sense. Infuriating because they died defending a regime that was clearly finished, and their deaths prolonged a war that was already decided. March 22, 1945. Third Army reached the Rhine River near Oppenheim. The Rhine, the great natural barrier of Western Germany, the river that German propaganda had insisted would never be crossed. Patton's engineers threw a bridge across that night. By morning, elements of Third Army were on the eastern bank. The crossing was so smooth, so unopposed, that Patton later told reporters. But Patton being Patton, he couldn't resist adding his own personal touch to the moment. He walked to the middle of the pontoon bridge, made sure photographers were watching, and urinated into the Rhine. Later, he would say, "I have just pissed in the Rhine River. For the sake of history, I wanted to do that." It was vintage Patton, crude, theatrical, and designed to humiliate the enemy. But it also reflected his genuine contempt for the German military at this point. They were beaten. Everyone knew it. The crossing of the Rhine, which should have been the great defensive battle, had been almost bloodless. Once across the Rhine, Third Army rampaged through southern Germany. The pursuit Patton had wanted in August was finally happening in March and April. German units were surrendering en masse. Entire divisions gave up without fighting. The roads were clogged with German soldiers walking west, trying to surrender to Americans rather than Russians. Patton wrote to Eisenhower, "A defeated enemy soldier is a pitiful sight." But there was no mercy in his operations. Third Army kept moving, kept attacking, kept pushing deeper into Germany. Patton wanted to get as far east as possible before the war ended, wanted to occupy as much German territory as he could. Then came the discoveries that would shake even Patton's hardened worldview. As Third Army advanced through Germany, they began liberating concentration camps. Ohrdruf, Buchenwald, places where the Nazi regime had systematically murdered civilians. Political prisoners, Jews, Roma, Soviet POWs, anyone the regime deemed undesirable. Patton toured Ohrdruf on April 12th. What he saw there affected him deeply. The emaciated survivors, the piles of bodies, the evidence of systematic torture and murder. Patton, who had seen more battlefield death than almost any American commander, was physically sickened. He vomited after the tour, but the experience also crystallized something for him. In conversations with his staff and in letters home, he reflected on what the war had been about. He said, Patton ordered local German civilians to tour the camps, to see what had been done in their name. He wanted them to understand. He wanted them to face what their regime had created. By late April, the collapse of German resistance was total. Third Army was advancing dozens of miles per day. German units were surrendering faster than they could be processed. The roads were jammed with refugees, displaced persons, former forced laborers, concentration camp survivors, all trying to get somewhere, anywhere, that might offer safety. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Third Army had advanced from Normandy to Czechoslovakia. They had liberated or captured thousands of towns and cities. They had taken over 600,000 prisoners. They had covered more ground and moved faster than any other Allied army. And Patton's assessment of what he'd witnessed? In his diary, he wrote simply, quote, 12. But the end of the war didn't end Patton's observations about Germany and the Germans. As military governor of Bavaria, he made statements that would prove controversial. He expressed sympathy for German civilians. He argued that not every Nazi Party member was a war criminal. He suggested that denazification was being pursued too zealously. These statements brought him into conflict with Eisenhower and with American occupation policy. Patton's pragmatic view was that Germany needed to be rebuilt quickly as a bulwark against the Soviet Union. He saw the Russians as the next threat and wanted to preserve German administrative capability to help counter it. It was vintage Patton again, always looking ahead to the next fight, always thinking strategically, but also displaying the same lack of political sensitivity that had gotten him in trouble before. In September 1945, Eisenhower relieved Patton of command of 3rd Army, assigning him instead to command 15th Army, essentially a paper organization compiling lessons learned from the war. It was a demotion, though not officially termed as such. Patton knew his active career was over. The war he'd trained for his entire life had ended. The German army he'd chased across France and into Germany was gone, disbanded, its soldiers going home to try to rebuild their shattered country. On December 9, 1945, Patton was seriously injured in a car accident near Mannheim. His neck was broken. He was paralyzed from the neck down. 12 days later, on December 21st, he died from complications of his injuries. He never wrote the memoirs he'd planned, never got to fully articulate his views on the war, on the German army, on what he'd witnessed during the collapse. But his words, recorded in diaries and letters and official reports, paint a picture of a commander who understood what he was seeing. The German army that had conquered most of Europe in 1940 and 41 was not the same army that collapsed in 1944 and 45. The veterans were dead or captured. The equipment was destroyed or worn out. The fuel was gone. The air cover was gone. The leadership was either fanatical Nazis who would fight to the death or pragmatists who knew the war was lost. Patton saw all of this. He saw it at Falaise, where the killing was so intense that the battlefield became impassable. He saw it in the fuel-starved retreat across France. He saw it in the desperate gamble of the Bulge. He saw it in the old men and children pressed into service in the final months. He saw it in the ease of the Rhine crossing. He saw it in the mass surrenders of April and May. And what he said, consistently, was that the German army was beaten, that they knew they were beaten, that the war should be pursued aggressively to finish them off, that any delay gave them time to recover, to establish new defenses, to prolong the killing. He was right. The German army of 1945 was a hollow shell, but it was a shell that still had teeth, that could still kill, that would fight on for months after any rational assessment said the war was lost. Patton's tragedy was that he saw the collapse coming in August 1944 and wasn't allowed to exploit it fully. His triumph was that when given the chance, in the relief of Bastogne and the drive across Germany, he showed what aggressive pursuit of a beaten enemy could achieve. The German soldiers Patton's 3rd Army captured in those final months told interrogators the same story. They'd known the war was lost. They'd known since the failure at Kursk, or the invasion of Normandy, or the encirclement at Falaise, or the failure of the Bulge. But they'd kept fighting because they were ordered to, because they feared the consequences of surrender more than the risks of continued combat, because the Nazi regime would execute deserters and their families. The collapse Patton witnessed wasn't just military. It was political, social, and psychological. An entire system, an entire way of organizing society for war, coming apart under the pressure of defeat. And Patton, for all his flaws, for all his controversial statements and political tone deafness, understood what he was seeing. He understood that this was the end of the Wehrmacht as a fighting force. He understood that the question wasn't whether Germany would lose, but how many more people would die before the regime accepted reality. His answer was to keep attacking, keep pursuing, keep the pressure on until the enemy had no choice but to surrender. It was an aggressive philosophy, one that cost American lives, but it also shortened the war, saved lives that would have been lost in a longer conflict, and demonstrated to the Germans that continued resistance was futile. When Patton stood at Falaise in August 1944 and surveyed the destruction, he was looking at the future of the German army, the future of the war, the future of Europe. And what he said, to anyone who would listen, was that the Germans were finished, that this was the moment to end it. That hesitation would only prolong the agony. He was right. But wars aren't fought by commanders alone. They're fought by soldiers who need fuel and ammunition and food. They're fought within political constraints and strategic frameworks. They're fought by coalitions that have to balance competing interests and priorities. Patton's genius was tactical and operational. He understood how to move armies, how to exploit success, how to keep an enemy off balance. His weakness was strategic and political. He didn't understand, or didn't care, about the larger considerations that shaped how the war was fought. But in those moments when he saw the German army collapsing, when he watched them stream eastward in defeat, when he crossed the Rhine against minimal resistance, when he accepted the surrender of hundreds of thousands of soldiers who knew they were beaten, Patton was in his element. And what he said was simple. "We have them, let's finish it." The German army collapsed in stages. First, the tactical collapse at Falaise, then the operational collapse in the race across France, then the strategic collapse after the Bulge. Finally, the total collapse in the face of the Rhine crossing and the final advance. Patton witnessed all of it. He documented it. He tried to exploit it. And in the end, he was part of the force that brought it about. The words he wrote in his diary, the statements he made to reporters, the letters he sent to superiors, all paint the same picture.